In this video, we are going to make quite a few, let's say, important points concerning the relationship between various stakeholders, especially managers, investors, but not only those two groups. So, at the very heart of this discussion is what is in theory known as the principal-agent relationship, and this is a theoretical framework which helps us explain the relationship between shareholders and managers. This is also often referred to as simply the agency relationship. Now, what's this all about? A principal is somebody who hires an agent, and you hire an agent, or the principal hires an agent, so that the agent performs a specific task or delivers a specific service to perform a task or some service. Now, in the context of corporate governance, the principal is the owner of the company, or basically the shareholders of the company are the principals in this relationship. The agent or the agents are the directors who are effectively hired by shareholders when shareholders vote at the annual general meeting to elect certain people to the board. And in fact, you could take this further, because directors subsequently hire members of at least of senior management. Management hires senior management hires lower level management, and so on. Now, the whole point is, you would expect, or it is expected, that the hired agents are going to act in the principal's best interest. So these guys are expected to act in the principal's best interest, and we, of course, translating this to the corporate world, also expect the directors to act, and subsequently managers who are hired by the directors, to act in the best interest of the shareholders. This relationship involves trust. The shareholders cannot monitor what the directors are doing all the time, so as to ensure that it is in their best interest. And often any principal, and shareholders in particular, are unable to verify kind of directly and precisely that the agent is indeed acting in their best interest, so that directors really are doing something that brings about shareholder value. This leads to the notion of agency costs. Agency costs are costs generated by the imperfections of this relationship, so to speak, and some of them are direct, in the sense that, very explicit direct costs. The fact that, for example, the directors of a company prepare its financial statements, which are primarily addressed to the shareholders, and via the financial statements, directors communicate with shareholders to tell them sort of what they've been able to do with the company that they are supposed to run on behalf of shareholders over the quarter, or maybe over the entire year, as is the case with annual financial statements. So, in order to provide a check on whether the information in those financial statements is indeed reliable, you typically hire an external auditor. So, the cost of hiring so-called monitoring agents, so somebody who will monitor whether whether the directors are indeed telling the sort of doing the right thing and telling the truth. A prime example of this are external auditors who check financial statements, and there are also sort of more indirect costs. And your book says, without going into any more detail, for example, lost business opportunities here. But it's not something I would really focus on. The other concept is one of information asymmetry. We have, asymmetry is spelled with one S, information asymmetry. This is something we've already mentioned in previous videos. It's all about the fact that directors and managers within the business typically, will always have more information about what's going on than the shareholders, or indeed providers of debt financing, so lenders also. And obviously, information asymmetry makes it difficult for the providers of capital to really properly assess what's going on in the company, to assess performance. They have to rely on the reports such as those contained in financial statements, which are prepared by directors and managers. Now, the main tool which we use to align the interests of the two groups, so main tool to align the interests of this group, directors and managers, with those interests or those of shareholders, is compensation, or specific compensation structures typically associated with awarding senior managers and senior members of staff with stock options or stock grants, which we hope incentivizes them to act in the best interest of shareholders, given that they have also joined this group. Now, your curriculum subsequently or then proceeds to discuss a couple of very specific areas where divergences may arise between the behavior of management and what, let's say, would be in the best interest of shareholders. So let's call these divergencies, and I just want you to obviously not memorize these, but have an appreciation for them. They say, well, what are some of the deficiencies, so to speak, of managers versus what shareholders would expect from them? First of all, insufficient effort. So let's write this is insufficient effort on the part of managers. Basically, managers doing too little, maybe being a bit lazy, maybe being engaged in something else rather than let's say putting in enough effort to steer the company correctly in the best interest of shareholders. Sometimes it's a question of inappropriate risk appetite. Obviously, once again, the risk appetite of the managers being either excessively high, so managers may display too much risk-taking behavior. And this may especially be the case if a large part of their compensation structure is composed of stock options, and those stock options become realistically valuable only once the share price of the company crosses a certain threshold, right, goes above the exercise price, in which case it doesn't really pay off to keep doing what you're doing and keep it steady, but risk doing something maybe excessively risky, with the hope that if it works out, that stock price will indeed increase. Sometimes it may be the problem of management taking too little risk, which would be the case if they're only paid some kind of fixed salary that has no stock options or stock grants in it. Why risk the company's performance if you can just get your cash salary, or perhaps a bonus for good performance, but still a cash bonus. Now, another problem may be empire building, or something that is referred to as empire building, when managers just seek growth for the sake of growth. Seeking for, let's say, growth's sake. And this is typically associated with pursuing, let's say, acquisitions, which may not necessarily be the best acquisitions in terms of choice of target or consideration price paid, but the directors, the managers simply want to grow an empire and be in charge of it. Another problem is entrenchment. This is where managers act in a way that simply allows them to keep their jobs. So acting so as to keep their jobs. And you may think, well, that's a good thing. I mean, if you act in a way that allows you to keep your job, surely that's a sign of good performance. But what we mean here is that sometimes people, let's say, refuse to simplify certain tasks or jobs. They prefer to keep things complicated, because if that is the case, they appear to have work. If you make things too lean, too efficient, then somebody will have to lose their job, and that may be you, right, if processes are improved. So sometimes things are kept excessively, let's say, excessively old-fashioned, because people don't want to change, because that may mean their job becomes completely obsolete or redundant. Now, another problem, this one more obvious, would be self-dealing. This is where managers, but this could also be at lower levels of the hierarchy, are found exploiting company resources. So, for example, using the corporate credit card, or using company, travel, maybe private corporate jets or something like that for personal benefit. And this, of course, is against the interest, or detrimental to the interests of shareholders and shareholder value. Right, so these are some of those divergences. Now let's turn to a very important topic, namely the relationship between different types of shareholders, between the controlling and minority shareholders. In all the previous videos, when we talked about shareholders or holders of equity, we treated them as pretty much one group. However, in reality, they're often that is often a very diverse group with quite diverse interests. So, your book says that equity or company ownership may be either dispersed. And what we mean by that is that there are many shareholders where no one, right, none of them can exercise control over the business. So that's dispersed. And of course, the opposite of that would be concentrated on ownership. Concentrated ownership. where didn't mean to cross that out, where you have either a single controlling shareholder who has the majority of the votes, controlling shareholder, or indeed a group of shareholders, like a family, for example, who can exercise control. And as I said, therefore, you can't treat necessarily shareholders as a homogeneous group, because they may have different interests. For example, a controlling shareholder or a big shareholder, like say a founding family. So the family of whoever founded that business, maybe many decades or even many years ago. They typically have a large portion of their wealth invested into that specific company. So from their perspective, it would be natural to expect management of the company to diversify into other areas so that their wealth gets diversified and becomes, I guess, less risky as well. On the other hand, that same company may have quite a lot of smaller minority shareholders for whom this is just one of many businesses whose shares they own. And from their perspective, attempts to diversify the business don't make much sense, because they, having their wealth already dispersed, they can easily diversify across different companies by buying a few shares here, a few shares there, and they would probably prefer management of a company to focus on the core business rather than pursuing certain diversification attempts at the company level. So as you can see, this can lead to very different expectations of management. Also, a controlling shareholder may have no intention of selling their shares, at least in the short term or medium term, and they typically have a sort of long-term perspective of the business, whereas smaller minority shareholders may actually expect to make quick gains, or may be looking for opportunities to make quick gains, and they want the company to cut costs, get rid of obsolete assets, dispose of stuff that's not needed right here, right now, and just produce cash so that this cash can be paid out. So these are just some examples of such divergence among the shareholder group. Now, very importantly, the simple fact that you own, or that an investor owns, a certain percentage of shares. So share ownership does not necessarily always mean voting power, or just the simple fact that you own 5% of a company's shares doesn't mean that you have 5% of the votes. The reason for this is that some companies have different classes of shares. These are classes of common ordinary shares. Share classes like Class A, Class B, will result in what we often call or term the dual class structure. This is effectively what they create. And what often happens is certain shareholders, especially, the founders of a business, may hold, some shares that belong to a specific class. Let's call it Class A, and that class, for example, of shares gives them a disproportionate amount of votes at the AGM. So let's say, 2 votes per share, or 5 votes per share, or 10 votes per share, whereas other shareholders, also ordinary, they also, all the ordinary shareholders participate in an ordinary dividend, but some classes of shares give more votes than one to their holders. Other businesses, on the other hand, may issue ordinary shares that do not carry voting rights. This is, for example, the case at a company called Paramount, which has Class A and Class B shares, as far as I remember, and Class B shares are non-voting shares. That's also reflected in the price, but both are ordinary shares, so both participate in the ordinary dividend. So what these share classes allow for is that they allow some shareholders to maintain control over the business despite not holding more than 50% of the company's shares. And of course, this is a mechanism to avoid relinquishing power, avoid the dilution of power, you could say. However, I want to make it very clear, and the curriculum is clear on this. The CFA Institute is not a big fan of such structures. CFA Institute is very openly against dual class share structures. They think that dual class structures are a hindrance, to proper corporate governance, and they stand on the ground that all shareholders should have an equal portion of the vote. Right, you should know this. Now, there's also the conflict of interest between shareholders and creditors. However, this is something we talked about quite extensively in previous videos when we discussed the two groups of capital providers. Let's just recall that what debt holders care about is not the maximization of company value. Maximizing company value may mean taking risks, and debt holders are typically risk averse. They prefer the company to generate stable, predictable cash flow that's sufficient to cover their claims. They don't want the company to take on additional leverage, borrow additional money, because that creates more risk for them, and they are in favor of limiting the distributions to shareholders, things like dividends or stock buybacks. On the other hand, shareholders prefer greater risk, typically. They're in favor of greater leverage. So, instead of issuing further equity, which would potentially cause dilution to them, they prefer the company to borrow more money. So those are sort of the typical stances that we already discussed when we did the video on the two providers of capital, or at least those two groups.